This lecture is on the January-February LD topic, the appropriation of outer space by private entities is unjust. In today's lecture, I'll start with the resolution, identifying some key terms, talk about the core values associated with the arguments on both sides of the topic, review the core affirmative and negative arguments, the particular ones, and conclude with some strategy suggestions. Now, a couple notes as we start with the resolution. First of all, it is important, and I'll emphasize this again, that the resolution is worded in the negative. So the affirmative is arguing it is unjust. And then the second thing is let's look at some key terms, which is where we'll begin. Appropriation. Appropriation is generally defined as the act of taking something for one's own use, typically without the owner's permission. So not always, it doesn't have to be without the owner's permission in the context of space exploration, right? And space resource acquisition. Arguably, nobody is the owner. Perhaps some alien civilizations have asserted some rights to these resources that we are unaware of. But in cases of, asteroids or the moon, there at least is no claimant. We'll talk about that a little more when we talk about international law. But it's not the case that you're taking some property that I particularly bought. But it is kind of the idea of taking something and claiming it. And I say in this context, a lot of the definitions say illegally, but that's not really what this resolution is about. There are some definitions that say exclusively. So you're appropriating exclusively. If you're a private company, that probably is what you are doing. Outer space. Outer space is the space immediately beyond the Earth's atmosphere. It includes not just that, but it's at least immediately beyond the Earth's atmosphere and beyond. And as we'll discuss, could include resources and just even other space. What are private entities? Private entity is anything that is essentially not an entity that's non-governmental. Obviously you could have a private corporation, which we're dealing with really in the context of this resolution, or a nonprofit. But obviously nonprofits don't really have the resources to go and explore outer space. So we're basically talking about businesses. Unfortunately uses the term to define itself, but it's just something, it just basically means to treat a person or a thing in a way that they do not deserve. So the idea really behind the resolution for the affirmative side is to argue that if these resources are appropriated by private companies, by private actors, this is unjust, or it's unfair to other companies that are and other individuals who do not gain access to these resources, right? So if you look at, it's not that there's necessarily a core body of literature that specifically addresses the question of justice versus injustice, but there is kind of a lot of evidence that, in articles that kind of generally talk about like how fair or how moral this is, or how it is consistent with principles of distribution or international law. I will say that justice is not really necessarily the same thing as freedom. And justice is arguably more about the appropriate distribution of resources, right? So if we want to say that justice is not kind of the same thing as freedom, just because, obviously there are strong negative arguments that say that private entities should be free to just kind of gain access to these resources and use them as they wish. And part of freedom is private enterprise, but that's arguably not the same as justice, and something that you can debate about. Just because something undermines freedom does not necessarily mean that it undermines justice. A few final notes about kind of the resolution. First of all, like many Lincoln Douglas resolutions, there is no actor. Right? Are we talking about the European Union, Russia, or China? And of course, on the circuit, we now have people, and have been for many years, reading specific plans, right? So we say, okay, is it unjust for companies in Russia or China, the European Union, to do this? So specific advantages can come from that. We could also have, of course, specific disadvantages. I already saw that somebody read an Indian aerospace industry disadvantage that says that the development of India's aerospace industry is important to its economy, and if we didn't allow them to appropriate the resources, their economy wouldn't develop. Economic decline in India could cause a war between India and Pakistan. The second thing I want to note about the resolution is, of course, as I started with, it's reversed. Remember, the affirmative is arguing it is unjust. Third, while philosophical arguments are obviously important in Lincoln Douglas, there are just like a lot of practical arguments that are going to matter, just stemming from utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. We'll be talking about the role that private industry plays in space exploration and development. There's a lot of great evidence on that now, that it's really private industry that's really driving the space exploration and development, that they have the talents, that they have the economic resources, that they really have the technology, which, regardless of anything else, the governments can always appropriate more economic resources, but all the technological talent and technological control is kind of developed by the private sector. And then, of course, I think you really need to, especially if you want to make that argument on the negative, why is appropriation so critical to space exploration development? Why do private companies need to control these resources and not maybe, gain in other ways from outer space, such as, developing space tourism? Now, I can think of a lot of reasons why the appropriation is important, right? They're only going to do this if they can gain access to the minerals and the other resources that are on the asteroids, that are on the other planets, that, if space includes, as we'll talk about, not just the physical elements, but also the spatial elements, and they need some control of that, then why is that? That's important to them. And to transition there, what are some space resources that could be appropriated? Well, first of all, there are non-tangible resources, right? Space resources include non-material assets, right? Such as orbital locations and abundant sunlight that enables satellites to provide services to the Earth. Now, look, the orbital locations, to a degree, there's a lot of them, right, are exclusive. If companies put up tens, hundreds of thousands of satellites, there's only so much orbital space, right? So when we haven't really, we as a society really haven't talked about that much, because we're nowhere near kind of, approaching the limit of orbital space. But within certain orbits, there only is so much space. So if they acquire that can trade off. That space might have to be appropriated. In terms of the sun, not really, right? Because it's not like if a solar-powered satellite or something similar absorbs so much sun, that same sun isn't available to be absorbed by something else. So that's probably not a resource that has to be appropriated, at least in the sense of being mutually controlled. But orbital locations might. And of course, then, when we have, right, mining, whether it's asteroids or planet, it's the exploitation of raw materials and, potentially bringing those resources back to Earth, or just using them, right, to kind of power things and to kind of further go ahead and colonize outer space. The finally thing is just a couple points here, right? So new space is a term that generally refers to the space activities of private entities. So you can use that as a keyword, or you can use it as just kind of when you're reading about this, like how you want to go about it. The second thing is, part of this new space movement, there are a lot of companies that are kind of, exploring outer space themselves, that have plans to colonize outer space themselves, that are launching satellites into orbit themselves. But there are also now a lot of contracts that the government has, the governments in general have, with private space companies, for the reason that I mentioned before: talent, resources, right? Like long-term economics. Even in the United States, where we have NASA, which has led U.S. space exploration development, they're really contracting now with private companies to lead the development of the space station, the new space station that will replace the current one, to lead the development of hopefully returning to the moon. So they have lots of contracts with Elon Musk, SpaceX, and other large space private entities, which of course brings in, the issue of government-private cooperation. But this is a very kind of a lucrative area. It's really, you can find a lot of recent articles, and if you look at our daily update, there's a lot of evidence just about how private companies are really kind of taking off developing, taking off, no pun intended, but really kind of leading the development of space. In terms of core values, right, we're looking at the affirmative. It's going to say things like, hey, these are common resources. They really shouldn't be appropriated by particular private companies. That there's that we shouldn't be so capitalistic. And in this case, maybe not so neoliberal. Neoliberal refers to the idea of combining government efforts with private industry and government supporting private industry, which is clearly what we're seeing now. So we can't decide based on, just like letting the first people to go get it, find it, and keep it. We should really kind of have maybe some rules or some common ideas or understandings as to how to do this. The negative, there's going to be a lot of utilitarianism arguments, right? And then stressing how the private sector is important. We need to protect the private sector. We need to have freedom. We need to fulfill our just obligations to saving the planet and to saving future generations by allowing private industry to continue to invest and develop these resources. And this is the only way that we are going to be able to do it. All right, let's now look at some of the core affirmative arguments. I think the first major argument, and what may be the most popular argument, is that the common heritage principle. You can take these resources and say, look, it's a little unclear what it means, but the basic idea is that the resources of outer space belong to everyone. What that means in practice is it's a little unclear. Does like every person living on Earth and every future person, right, of which there are arguably trillions, assuming we don't go extinct, have like a small fraction of those space resources that like they're somehow entitled to kind of find a way to go get. So I guess I'm entitled to some small fraction of an asteroid, regardless of like whether or not I can really practically access that. And Jeff Bezos's or Elon Musk's space companies shouldn't be allowed to go get that small fraction of the asteroid that I own, at least without my permission. Or the second thing is, does it kind of belong to all the governments on Earth to kind of like, they should kind of figure out like how these resources are allocated, at least amongst countries. Obviously, that would be pretty difficult to imagine how that would play out in practice, who is entitled to what. But there's kind of this basic idea that these are common resources that belong to everybody. It's unclear, too, why they just belong to humans as opposed to maybe other space aliens, but that's the idea behind the common heritage principle. The second thing is international law, which you could kind of also think of as a contract. Contracts, the value of contracts that have been debated in LD a lot recently, right? So the idea is that behind international law, that we've negotiated these treaties, and there's a big interpretation, there's an interpretation battle, so to speak, over the Outer Space Treaty, whether or not it prohibits private companies from accessing space resources or not. But the idea is that international law really kind of prohibits, you would argue on the affirmative, prohibits private entities from exploiting these space resources. And that we need to protect international law, perhaps in the moral sense to protect a contract in this case amongst countries, but you could also have some utilitarian impacts relating to how international law constrains warfare. Third thing, as I mentioned earlier, you can argue the private actors are exploitive, right? Capitalists take resources and try to take advantage of them, or that neoliberalism is in itself bad when you have governments kind of supporting private companies. You could, some people have argued that private actors kind of crowd the global south, the developed countries, out, that they don't have the capabilities to develop these space resources. The companies aren't as strong, and that basically you have all the northern countries, the developed world, going ahead and gaining access to all the orbital space, that they need to have their satellites, as we discussed earlier, and the other space resources. There's an argument that we should focus our efforts here on making Earth better itself, rather than just kind of continuing to develop new areas. There's an argument that competition can lead to war, that if you have competition amongst these private companies, then governments get behind and back these, and this leads to war. There are arguments about space junk, right? That when we put more satellites and engage in more space activity, the stuff that's there, the junk kind of just gets left aside. This makes further space exploration and development more difficult, and some people argue it could lead to war because this space junk could end up hitting the satellite or or a future space station that's owned by a particular country. That may be seen as an act of aggression, right, or at least an act of irresponsibility that could lead to war. Other people say that space development supports the use of drones. We've had many arguments and debate about whether drones are good or bad. And then there's kind of questions just of militarism. Are these private companies, they're making a lot of money by militarizing space, by developing space weapons, especially through contracts with the government. Other people say it's bad to develop space because it'll bring us into contact with other aliens that might kill us. And as a side on that, I've also seen in the past some arguments about space debris. I think the negative arguments can be divided into two types of arguments, as I mentioned earlier. First of all, you have kind of your utilitarian arguments, your practical arguments that stem from actual space development, and then you have your values arguments. Space development, private sector support for space development is arguably very important. Right, that we need the technology, as I said, the talent from from private industry in order to be able to develop outer space, especially kind of, when we're talking about colonizing other planets. We also need like the competition between the companies to kind of drive the development of the technologies and further exploration. And also there's just kind of some good evidence that just kind of says that the interest level of the private companies right now is much higher than the interest level of the governments in terms of dealing with space exploration. The negative arguments, I've mentioned the freedom or libertarianism argument. This is kind of based on the idea that governments really shouldn't be restraining private industry at all. They should really kind of be celebrating and promoting private industry, that there's a freedom. Freedom includes the right to kind of acquire property, especially property that other people have not claimed. And it is kind of a strong argument in favor of letting private companies do what they want. You could look at the contracts argument on the other side and say that, look, these private companies should be able to enter into contracts either with governments or just in a way to gain access to these resources. And then there's also, I mentioned international law and how that may restrain kind of private industry. But a lot of people say customary international law, which deals with how international law is not so much the written word of the international law, but what's the practice? How do countries relate to each other? How are resources developed? How do norms develop? And the idea is that regardless of what the Outer Space Treaty says, that right now countries of the world are approaching outer space in a way that really kind of encourages the development of resources by private companies, and this is consistent with international law. What are some benefits, general benefits to space exploration? Well, of course, we can what we call get off the rock, that eventually people say that there will be human extinction for different reasons. It could be because of climate change, it could be because of asteroids hit the Earth, it's because some people say we'll inevitably use all the nuclear weapons that we have, and we're basically going to destroy the planet. So the only way to kind of essentially survive as a human species is to go other places. Other people say that, look, it's just kind of part of human aspirations to colonize other planets, to grow as a species. There's a lot written about the colonization of Mars. This used to be incredibly theoretical, but now we even have people like Elon Musk talking about how their companies are going to terraform, meaning make Mars inhabitable for humans. We could avoid resource shortages because, a lot of the asteroids in outer space contain a lot of resources that will help with kind of protecting with, eventually maybe we're going to run out of oil, minerals, other types of resources that they need. These resource shortages here on Earth are already bringing countries into conflict with one another, and that, we will have access to more resources. It could also protect human rights because a lot of these resources are mined in like very dangerous ways, and they cause a lot of health problems. There's a lot of forced labor that occurs here on Earth that will not necessarily occur in space because you have private industry, doing this. Obviously, these problems could replicate themselves in space there. And then, of course, you have the protection of the environment. If they're mined in space as opposed to mined on Earth, they don't have the environmental problems. There's stuff written about what we call post-scarcity and decoupling, right? The idea behind decoupling is that humans become less dependent on the physical environment here on Earth, and therefore aren't dependent on our existing environment and the resources we have. Some people in this context talk about generating artificial resources, but here what we're really talking about in post-scarcity, post kind of decoupling and post-scarcity is we get the resources from somewhere else, so they don't become scarce and we don't have conflicts over them. We might also need to develop outer space to deflect asteroids. We could stimulate economies through all this space exploration and development and all this activity, all these jobs, all this technological development, all this energy and in the industry behind this could really serve to stimulate the economies. And of course, we could develop technologies that have other uses along the way. In particular for the United States, although the resolution isn't specific to the United States, could make it possible for the United States to compete with Russia or China to develop space technology, to develop its own aerospace industry, to potentially, like I said, develop drones, which we may need for combat operations, and just protect its overall hegemony and leadership in the world.